Okay, we've got our Photoshop lower third imported into Vizrt T5. We are now at the point where we want to recreate the text because we need to set up a template so that we can change this text. And currently, as we imported it into Vizrt T, we cannot do that. So we are going to change that. Furthermore, we have a breaking news box up here, and we probably don't want it within the scene. We want to break this out into its own scene. So I'm going to merge this object down and save it off so that we can drag it into another scene at a later time. And if you watched the 3D geometries video, you know that we can merge an object by coming up here and using the two icons called split and merge. So I have my topmost group highlighted, and I can just click the merge button here, and that's going to create a little 3D geometry, and we can highlight our G tab and we can slide that down here and we can give this a name. And now it is a 3D object or a geometry, which it is now saved, and we can use it in another scene at a later time. So I'm just going to slide that to the trash can. We don't need that anymore. Now we need to match up the text. So I'm going to create a new group down here, and I'm going to call this one Vizrt Text. Now we need to start dragging our fonts over, and it's important to note that we are actually using the Viz engine render and not the classic render mode. So that means when we come and look for our fonts and we go into our F tab, there's not going to be anything in there to use, because what we need to do is use our font faces. And if we come into our font faces, we have a couple of selections here. So we can start dragging this font up into our scene tree. So I'm going to take our first font, and number one, we could drag it up into the scene tree here and then reposition it this way. But you see when we released it, where it puts it into the scene tree, so you have to come back and slide it in there anyway. Or the other option is you could slide it into the scene tree, into the container where you need it, and then the font shows up here and you can click and drag within the scene editor window, or come over to your position, rotation, transformation, and do it this way as well. I'm going to leave the text there at the moment. I'm going to click on the text icon to go into the text transformation properties. What we want to do is change the color. So within the Vizrt T font faces and the new Vizrt T5, we have an option to color the text right within the font itself. But before we do that, we just need to make sure that this text is actually highlighted so that it will pick it up. So we click in the scene editor window, it is highlighted, we come into the color, we change the color. Now we come up top to the font editor and we can just type in a new headline. Okay, so here's our first text. Now we want to go down and find another text for the subheadline. So we'll slide another font right up into the scene, and we can use the transformation editor again to reposition this, and we'll just select on it to select it so that we'll be able to change the color here. We also want this color as a black. And notice there are a lot of different other settings over here for the font that you could set up. We cover them in the font videos if you want to check them out, or you have any questions about what those things do. So we have two fonts here, and we could spend all day probably just tweaking and placing and sizing this. We're not going to spend too much time within this on that tutorial. We have one more font here that we just want to add right up here to the top part of this lower third. So we're just going to find one more font here that we can use. So we'll find one more font here that we can use and drag this up into the scene tree. Again, we'll just use our transformation editor here to reposition this, and then we'll come up into our text editor and change the text, and you can type in whatever you want. Go to the transformation editor again, we'll just move it over roughly right around here. One other thing that we had within the scene is our logo, and that came in as a hidden element. So I'm just going to turn that on, and you can see we have a little icon here for our lower left logo, which is a separate element from the other layers as well. Finally, down here in the lower right, there's one more text box that we want to make, and that is a clock. Now we could copy fonts by holding down Control, clicking, or we could just come down and select a whole new font again for this. And here's a condensed font that we want to use. Again, we're just going to go into the transformation editor here and reposition this. This time we want to do a little bit different in that we want to use a plugin to create a time. And if we go into our plugins folder, into the tools folder, there is a plugin called System Time, and we can drag this right onto our font here, and you can see that it changes that font into a little clock. And what I'm going to do is just reposition the clock right here. We're going to go into the System Time setting. I'm going to take this box and drag it out so that we can see it a little bit better. And within the System Time, we have an hour, minutes, seconds. So I'm just going to get rid of the seconds, and we're just going to keep it on hours and minutes. And we'll slide this container back into the upper right here. So now you can see our clock down here in the lower right. And again, you just need to tweak the position and the sizing. If you need to make any changes as far as what this clock says, AM, PM, do that within the settings itself. So we'll scale this down just a tad, and then, like I said, we spend a lot of time repositioning it, making it perfect, but we're going to move on because the last thing that we need to do is show you how to constrain this headline so that it doesn't go over the border when someone is typing. And we can use another plugin found within the tools folder for that, and it's called the Max Size plugin. So I'm going to go ahead and drag that onto my headline. At any time, if you want to rename your containers to, you could just come in here and double click on it, rename it, and then hit the down arrow, and then go down to the next container and rename that as well, and so forth and so forth. We're just going to leave it right here. We have a max size on it. We're going to come over to our max size, and what we do is just test how many characters we have. So I'm going to come in here and type in X until it reaches the end, and you can see when we reach the end it stops kerning out and it just stays in one spot. So now we want to obviously tell it that it can go to the edge of the white box here. So we need to go into our max size. I'm going to hold down the control button and click with my little spinner here just to go in smaller increments. So I'm going to leave it right about there. That means if anyone comes into the text and they type any more than that it's not going to go past that line. Once you have it on the max size, or once you have the max size plugin on one font, you could obviously copy it down to your next line, but you will have to readjust the settings because every font is a little bit different. Okay, so we have our fonts recreated. We've used one plugin called the Max Size to constrain the size of the font, and we also put a System Time clock on our lower right bug there. So next step would be to animate our lower third in, and that's what we'll move on to next. Before you do that, make sure that you save your scene, and you can do that two ways. You can click the little save button, or you could just do a save as and save it as a new name.